Hi, welcome to my studio. I'm so glad you've joined me today for this little mini portrait. Be sure that you are prepared. You've got your paints ready, you've got your images printed to actual size if possible. I'm just painting a little 5x5. You can do whatever size you'd like and have your drawing ready, and then we can get started.
The reference photo we're using today is by Jan Kopriva on Unsplash. Unsplash is a website that offers free reference photos for artists to use copyright free. I've desaturated the photo and lightened the shadows so that I can see better what's going on in the photo. And then I took it into my editing program and posterized it to about 4 values. And finally, my drawing is ready and I'm ready to paint. Hopefully you are too. Let's get started. So the first thing I do on my portraits is mix up 3 colors. I make a very light value puddles, about 10% value. And so they're pretty watery. This is going to be the underpainting for my flesh, actually the lightest areas of the flesh. I don't leave any of the paper white, with the exception of possibly some highlights. So the first color was a quinacridone gold. Second color is quin coral, and you can see that I test them on paper first to make sure they're not too dark or too light. And I also want these first puddles of color to be similar in value, so the blue may need more water than the yellow did. This blue is peacock blue. Uh, this triad is pretty typical of how I start. I do sometimes, substitute Hooker's green for the peacock blue, or I might add a fourth color like orange or magenta. So there's not a formula. So just whatever 3 colors that you like on your palette that play well together. And then we're just going to take it right across the flesh. I'm going to try to reserve the highlights in his eyes. So starting with that peacock blue, and then I try to get the excess color off the brush before I dip it in the next color. If I do rinse, I want to get as much water off as possible before I dip into the next puddle in order to not dilute the mixture that I've already got ready. So just kind of alternating between those 3. I do tend to like it to be warmer around the nose and lips and cooler around the eyes. And I am going right over the upper teeth that are in shadow and then just trying to reserve some of the white on the lower teeth. And just finishing it up. I want to lift up that little bead off the bottom so it doesn't bloom back. And then getting most of the moisture off of that clean brush, I'm just going to touch on those teeth so they won't be too dark. Here I'm taking some quin magenta with brilliant orange, and I'm just going to make a kind of a dark mixture. I want to begin to work on the features, adding some Perylene maroon, or at least having that ready so I can, go back and forth. Okay, so starting with the nostrils, you want to remember that the top edge will be a hard edge, and then the bottom will be softer. So I'm taking that damp brush and just softening out the bottom of the nostril. Just kind of continuing back and forth, reinforcing the dark area, softening where it looks too hard, and just taking my time, tickling that area. It's not going to be dark enough even after this first layer, even though it looks really dark. Uh, so I'm just really starting to establish those shapes. Inside of the mouth, they're always tricky, but you really need to go nice and dark at the corners. I'm being very careful to paint around the teeth. I'm a very slow painter, so um, the molars in the back are not pure white, so I'm kind of softening and letting some color flow into those areas while I create nice hard edges around the front teeth. So sort of using this dark mixture to get my shape right, and then I'll pop in some lighter color in the middle. Just don't make it one solid color or value, because there's things going on inside the mouth, the tongue, particularly the tongue. So just, again, being very careful with this pointy synthetic brush. I decided on these tiny 5x5s that these little, I think they're Trekkel. I won a couple of them in a competition, and I really like them. They've got this great point, so I ordered a couple more. But for the most part, up to this point, I was using my Kolinsky sables, the size 12, I'm trying to think, size 12 and 9, I believe. I do have a 16 that I use for larger pieces. And I really like the Kolinskys, which is what I'm softening this with, because they're soft and they hold a lot of water. And I just keep using the same puddles, but I might add a bit of color. Here I used orange just to change it a little bit. And I just want to get in that eyelid line and softening edges, popped in a little blue. On a child, I don't want to go too dark underneath the eye, so I'm really softening that out so it doesn't get too dark. I'm just really just establishing shapes. Again, I'm painting a 5x5, and you're welcome to take these images and make it as large as you'd like. If you go quite a bit larger, you might want to use larger brushes. Still working on the darkest dark areas of the flesh. Even in areas where you can't really tell what's going on, you want to get those shapes right, and then it'll read. I like to establish the edges of the jawline. I look for edges to do that. And of course this is perfect because it goes right into his red jacket. I work around the page. I don't want to get too stuck in one area, because that's when you tend to overwork and mess things up. And here I am messing things up on purpose. I like to pop in water here and there, especially in, like, this is a corner area where it's just a solid shape, so I can make it more interesting by allowing some blooms to happen. I'm even switching into a little blue along the jawline. Now I'm getting into my Quinburnt Orange, and I want to start to establish his iris. He's got dark brown eyes, so I'm carefully painting around the highlights. And this is my number 9 Kolinsky sable, and you can see it's kind of old. It does not have a point anymore, but I kind of like it that way. And I'm going to pop in some purple just to darken it a bit here and there. It's mineral violet, to be exact. And doing the same thing on the other side. I don't paint around the pupil because the pupil is darker than the iris. The only time I might paint around an area of the pupil would be if there's a highlight there, but I also try to avoid highlights being smack dab in the middle of the eye. That always just looks kind of freaky. So even if it shows that on the photo, I like to move it to one side or the other and try to have them fairly even on either side. Just small details make a big difference. So now I've just added some ultramarine blue to the brown mixture, and I'm starting to suggest the eyelashes. The eye is still wet, so you can see the black is bleeding into it, and I used the back of my brush to pull out some fine lashes. Remember, perfection is the enemy, so try not to fuss around too much, which is not easy. And I went out and got my teeny tiny one so I could fuss a little bit. That's my number 2. Gosh, that's a low Cornell. They don't make them anymore. They've been taken over by King Art, where you can find, I think it's the same brush, just under a different name. But this is a number 2, or that was a number 2, which is normally the only thing I do with it is use it for my signature. There it is. So even when I'm using these tiny synthetics, I'll still take my Kolinsky to soften edges. Just continuing they're still wet, just continuing to drop in color here and there. Kind of using my Kolinsky brush as a chisel. I can get some nice lines, fine lines. I am a slow painter, so feel free to speed this up if you need to. If you go to the settings icon in the corner of the screen somewhere, you can change the playback speed. So you can go a little bit faster, you can go a little bit slower, whatever you need to make this video work for you. And he's starting to come alive here. Suggesting some of those lower lashes. Keeping them really light. You can always darken them later. But also remembering that we're working on virtually white paper, so they're going to look darker than they'll look at the end. So just kind of back and forth. We're sort of establishing those darks, but you can see how light his flesh is once it's dried. I am going to show you an image after this first stage where you can really assess the colors. The colors on the video are a little bit more washed out than they are in real life. Here I grabbed some Scarlet Lake and mixed it with some of that dark brown mixture on my palette to darken it. And I'm working on the inside corners of the eyes to warm them up, and then adding a little blue to make a neutral gray to work in some of the shadows from the eyelids onto the whites of the eye. A little bit more red in the corners. A lot of these, when I'm putting them on, they're still wet, so the next color will bleed into it, which is what I want to make them soft transitions. I'm using that shadow color to get some of the lash shadows on the left side, which is his right eye, and the outside corners of his eyes, and also to gray down the teeth a bit. I'll keep the ones in the very front the lightest, but as they go back, they will get toned down. A little more black to establish the pupil. Just tickling an edge here or there so it's not perfect. We've got Winter Yellow Deep with a little bit of that Scarlet Lake, and I'm putting some color on his ear. Adding some warm Scarlet Lake, Winter Yellow Deep. I think I popped a little Quin Gold in there. Just what I don't really think about it. I just grab. So I'm just creating some of these shadow areas on his flesh. And I keep it pretty light. I can always darken it, but again, just like with the features, I want to establish the shapes. Once I get the shapes right, then it's a lot safer to go dark. So I'm constantly going back and forth, putting down pigment, and then taking a clean damp brush to soften it out. I've just added some, I think, Quin Magenta to the orange mixture to get some of these darker shadows on the inside of the eye socket. I've been starting to use Quin Magenta rather than blue, although, again, it's not a formula. Sometimes I might use blue, but in this case, I'm going with the Quin Magenta for the darkest shadow areas. Adding a bit of Winter Yellow Deep to it to get the shadow underneath the lower lip. And now I'm going into some blue. Just be intuitive. It's really, the value is going to make a bigger difference than color. Color just makes it interesting. So now that I've put a little blue under his lower lip, I'm adding it in a few other places. Just to establish some of the shadow areas. And again, going fairly lightly here to get the shape right. So I mentioned how slow a painter I am. This is actually sped up to 150%. So as slow as it looks, I'm slower. But I did want to mention when I mix up the paint on my palette, as you saw me mixing that blue, the peacock blue, I really mix it up well to be sure that I don't get clumps of pigment on my brush and to make sure that I have the value that I want. So, still working with that blue, establishing some of the shadow shapes. Here I've added a little bit of a warm mixture to connect with the blue. So kind of wet and wet there, letting the colors mingle. So one thing that comes naturally just from painting a lot is knowing how much water to pigment to use for your mixtures. Um, Too much water is going to pretty much disappear on the page. Too much pigment, well, I like to work in thin layers, so, but also using enough water. You can use enough water even when you're using stronger pigments and you're wanting to go dark. You still want to have plenty of water to allow the watercolor to look wet, to allow it to move, to avoid dry looking brush strokes, unless that's what you want. I'm continuing to build the form, sometimes overlapping areas that have already been painted to reinforce them or to adjust the color. I really want this to look like a face before I stop for a break. So I usually actually work these in maybe these little ones maybe in 2 or 3 goes. So, and again, it's really just my roadmap. So I'm wanting to establish certain shapes, thinking shapes more than what the item is. Though here I am adding the lightest blue to the hat and possibly in areas this light peacock blue will glow through the darker hat. I've left some beads of color at the bottom of the hat, and now I'm making a warm mixture to connect it into the shadow. That's going to keep me from having hard edges, hard lines. I want to lose some of those edges. Now I'm getting most of the moisture off my brush or switching brushes to a clean little brush where I can soften some of the edges of that shadow from his hat to sort of give the idea of the fuzziness of the hat. Continuing to mix some warms. Here's a brilliant orange and just trying to get that little cheek area established. And again, using a damp brush to soften those edges. I like to go a little pinker on the cheeks. I don't usually put blue in there. So again, I'm looking at the shapes very carefully. If you're new to portraiture, the posterized version is a real help when you're looking for shapes and trying to get the values right. And here I left that little slice or sliver of a lighter area on the edge, and then I took Scarlet Lake to kind of soften that out. I want that to suggest a red bounce from the red jacket. And there you can see the more accurate colors before you move forward. That's where we're at. Okay, getting back to work. I'm back to orange here. Now I'm going to think about intensifying some areas, starting with the inside of the mouth. I'm using Quin Coral and some mineral violet to darken the edges. Always being careful to paint around the teeth since I didn't use masking fluid. You could use masking fluid, but I always have trouble with those strong, hard edges. I just feel like they don't look natural, so I'd rather paint around the areas if I can. You see I'm dropping some orange in. Just looking at the shapes in the mouth, noticing what's going on inside there and trying to get the values right while I vary color. The molars in the back are in a lot of shadow, so I leave it light, let the darker areas settle a bit, and then I can glaze over it with a lighter value because I don't want them to be white. And always looking for edges where I can soften things out. Finally getting some color on the lower lip. It's in pretty strong light, so it's going to be pretty light. Again, just reading the values. Value is more important than color. You see I have tiny bits of color on my palette, but they are wet. But this is such a small portrait that I don't need to mix up large puddles. Also, I kind of just continue to add to them. I don't mind that the colors change or values change. I've got the harmony just by using the same pigments. Darkening the iris. I like to give variety there, so I might drop in purple, or even here I'm just kind of dotting in a damp brush to create texture. And now I'm dotting in those pupils again, letting them bleed out. I think that one's bleeding out a little bit too much. But you don't want two perfectly round black marbles in there. That just doesn't look natural, even if that's what it looks like on the photo. Find a place to soften an edge or lose an edge. And here you can see I'm doing a larger area, so I've got a little bit stronger pigment with a little bit more water, adding water to create blooms. And I also pulled that kind of into the cheek a bit because I want that bounced light. Just using a clean damp brush to soften that edge. Remember, every time that brush leaves the page, I'm I'm rinsing it, I'm dabbing it on that sponge to get most of the water out of it. And then I just go right straight into my palette, adjusting the water as needed, and I'm going to go back into the peacock, and again, just going back to what I've already painted and increasing the values, adding detail as I go. I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but I chose this photo from Unsplash because I liked the lighting on it. I liked the shadow shapes. I liked the value range that goes from darkest to lightest. And sometimes I think that just helps you make a better painting when your photograph already has great values. I just have to get them right. And here I am darkening that eye socket with a little bit of peacock blue. I do use very light layers. I like to build on them. I can always do another layer of blue if I need to. It's easier to add than to subtract in watercolor. I'm pretty much down to water there. Again, I definitely don't want to go too dark under a child's eyes. I don't want them to look like they have bags under their eyes. Now I'm pulling out some indigo, pretty strong. So more pigment, less water. And I'm going to attack that dark blue hat. I like to be sure I get that paint all the way to the edges because I like to float my paintings and I think it looks nicer when the edges are painted all the way to the edge without having a bunch of white spots showing through. So I'm thinking about the values even in the hat. Again, the posterized version might help for you to see the variety changes. And I'm just using that indigo mix, throwing in extra water where I want it lighter, going back into it because I want blooms and texture to happen to make it look like a knit cap. Even using my finger to kind of rough it up a little bit. Popping in a little bit of peacock to make this area a little bit lighter. And also a little bit of water to lighten the value there. Again, the paint is wet, so I can continue to drop it in if I want to. And this little edge here is darker. I often will work from just a black and white photo so that the colors in the reference photo don't influence my choices, which they obviously have here. I mean, it's just, I like to do that to be more creative and just let my intuition kind of tell me what colors to use. But I do like this combination. Going a little bit darker in these darkest areas. When you get darker, when you know, just increasing the value really helps to pop things out. So I'm darkening this shadow edge on the jacket, using indigo for that. Yeah. I like what that little bloom did in the bottom left corner. It kind of looks like a snowflake on his jacket. Going into a little purpley gray mixture to add those shadows from his eyelashes onto his eyeball. And I am careful to save the whitest areas. Even these pale shadows I do in layers. And once again, darkening that mouth. Being very careful with the edges and the teeth. They will get glazed back later, but while I'm working on these darkest areas, I do want to be really careful. I'd rather have to glaze them than have to lift back to the white, which just never looks perfect. You know, it never looks smooth, or at least it's more difficult to make it look smooth. And here I am going to glaze right. I know I'm going to glaze over those molars. Got to get those darks in first. Just tickling those edges. There we go. Popped in a little water just to, you kind of have to wait for just the right moment, because if you do it too soon, all the dark paint will flood into that area. And I really just wanted a tint. So I'm looking, as I'm getting this value, the value's darker in the mouth and in the eyes. You know, I'm looking around the page, and I want to make sure that other areas, especially looking at the black and white or posterized reference photos, you can kind of look around and see, like here, I need to darken areas here and there. I'll need to definitely darken areas in the hat. Here I'm just getting the corners of the eyes. We don't want them to, well, we want them to look round, so we need to shade those edges. And that was just me taking a clean damp brush and correcting an edge where it was bleeding over. Instead of worrying about exactly what color I'm using where, just know that I'm using all the warms in my palette and just mixing variety. It doesn't have to be the exact same color. I make a little puddle, I work around with it, I add another color to it, and it just all works out. So I adjust it as I go. And here I'm just darkening that shadow again. I'm looking to see where the lost edges are. It kind of gets lost into that eyelid there. And I can pull that flesh tone right into the hat because it's so dark. And now I'm getting some real value on the cheeks. Remember, I kind of got the shape right earlier, and now I'm going in a little bit braver with more value. And then just connecting everything with a clean damp brush, softening edges. Went right over that nostril. Just trying to connect as much as I can. We don't want areas where your eyes get stuck. We want your eyes to move around the page. Basically, I'm just putting down the shape and then softening edges as I go. It's just a matter of putting in the time and practicing the techniques. It always looks easier than it is, so don't get discouraged. And remember, I think at this point I'm at like 2 times speed, so I do paint very slowly. So feel free to slow this down. Remember, there's that little setting icon, that little gear, I guess, where you can click that and adjust the playback speed, either faster or slower. You can always pause it. The wonders of technology. All right, I had to clean that palette. This looks like magenta. I need to get those darks darker on the face. And I got my 2 brushes ready. The number 12 is what I'm putting pigment on with. And then the number 9 is the clean, damp brush that I can use to soften edges. I just always like to keep that ready, so I'm not constantly rinsing my brush, losing the pigment, adding water to my mix. You know, this way if I've got 2 brushes for 2 different purposes, it's just makes things easier. Going into that damp, clean damp brush and tickling edges just like before. And it's up to you how much you want the edges to be softened. Maybe you like harder edges. I've done it both ways. Lately it seems like I've been smoothing things out more. See, notice I've left that hard edge on that magenta on his cheek. I'm really wanting the paint to settle into the paper, but that will get softened before it gets completely hard. I was really happy when I discovered that Quin Magenta. So I've actually been using that more than I've been using blue or green to get the darker areas on the face. When it gets too purple, I can glaze it with yellow or a warm orangey yellow mixture, and usually that works out really well. And that's the fun about glazing, and the good thing about glazing is you can always change the color just by glazing a complement over it or an analogous color over it. So boy, his features are really coming out now. Remember, I've already lightened the reference photos, but even after doing that, I still probably won't get quite as dark as the photo, at least not all over. I may get tiny darks here and there where I want to emphasize the corners of the mouth and things like that, edges of the clothing, deep shadows. Without cleaning my brush, I went right into the orange to tone down that magenta. And for the third time now, I think I'm reestablishing that cheek, being a little stronger this time, getting that clean damp brush and softening the edges. Be careful when you're softening edges that, well, first of all, that you don't have too much water on the brush. You want it to be pretty dry so you don't introduce water and cause blooms unless you want to. And also remember that you're just barely tickling the edge. So you're not pushing or going back into where you've already painted. You're just tickling the very edge. Adding a little more color to the lips. Once again, it's all about shapes and value. Now I've added some yellow to the mix. And these shapes, the fine, subtle shapes, don't always show up on the posterized version. I usually posterize, if I'm going to use that, between, I'd say, 4 and 9 at the most. And so it's not going to pick up all the nuances. So I need to be looking at the original photo to see areas where, because I don't want huge solid white or light areas. I want variety everywhere. So here I'm just warming them up with that yellowish mixture. I'm careful to, I know I'm reworking areas that were only worked a few minutes ago, but it dries pretty fast. I do work on an angle. Usually I'm upright, close to 90 degrees. But for the videos, I'm closer to 30 or 45 degrees. So, I don't know, it seems like they dry faster, I guess top to bottom. But you can assess that. You don't want to go back in with too much water in an area that's not dry. So when I do go back over areas, like here, I'm going in with a darker and less watery mix. So I put the little dots on there for the stitching, and then I thought it was too too perfect, so I'm kind of messing it up. Also notice there are certain areas like the hat, like the clothing. He doesn't have hair, but hair would be a place where I would let blooms happen. Sometimes, if I want the paint to move rather than lifting those edges or blooming, I could just do this and just turn it and let the paint kind of disperse. I actually do that more often than you'd think. You saw how light that indigo dried, so I'm reestablishing that. And tickling it down into the shadow areas with a little bit of the flesh mixture. So I've worked this quite a bit, and I think we're getting close to another stopping point where I want to make sure that the painting is good and dry before I proceed. So I'm just taking that stronger indigo and darkening a few areas. And now you can see where I'm at with my values, and you can assess yours before you move forward to the next section. He's getting there. I'm sure I took my little heat gun and dried it. I came back. I've still got my paint on my palette. So just wanting to get those stronger values in. Okay, I'm just using some of the color on my palette, mixing up a nice gray to tone down those teeth. The front teeth are, the top two teeth are completely in shadow, and the bottom ones have some white highlights, so I'm kind of paying attention and painting around those highlights. And then going back and reestablishing some of the eyes, or the shadows in the whites of the eyes. A lot of these subtleties are important in a portrait. So I added a bit of the Quin Magenta into the indigo to get a nice darker purpley shade. I really need to get darker in these areas, and just using the red isn't cutting it. Just using the indigo is not cutting it. So mixing some of these darker colors to get some of these little tiny darkest areas. Again, softening with that damp brush. Just wanting, again, to get that variation in the hat. And now I'm getting back into the shadow. I decided to kind of skip and not just have one long purple line there. Always looking for places to break up lines. Getting some of that nice dark into his mouth. Seems like no matter how dark I go, I always need to go darker but between the nostrils and the mouth and even the ears. I've just taken some orange, and while that blue's still wet, I'm letting it bleed out into that cast shadow again. Remember, cast shadows are hard-edged. like that cast shadow from his hat across his forehead. It's a hard edge, but I've made it fuzzy because the hat is fuzzy. And then the cast shadow here from his nose is a hard edge because it's blocking the light onto his cheek. And then the form shadows, like around his nose and cheeks, those are softer because it's really the light or the value is showing the turn of the face, the curve of the cheek. Warming things up. I don't want the eyes to look like almonds, so I always, even on the outer corner, I add a color to show that the eye is a ball and it's going back into the head. So I'm not sure how many layers we've got so far, but often it can be up to 6 or 8 or more in the darkest areas. It's just really important that the area is dry before you do the next layer. Unless you're dropping in wet and wet. Just tiny. I've got this dark purple, so even though, well, I guess you wouldn't think eyelashes should be purple, it's a dark, eyelashes are dark, so that's what I'm using, just like I used the indigo for the pupil. So I just use whatever's on my palette and work around the page. I just put in a little bit of Quin Burnt Orange on the eyes, warming up the tongue, just looking for areas here and there. And his face is looking pretty purple right now, so don't worry about that. We are going to warm that up on the next big flesh layer. And it will make all the difference. So cleaning my palette and getting that warm. So now I like to do the darks first because then I'm putting the warm over it and it's just giving another chance for those edges to get softened with this layer. So if I worked light to dark, then, well, I think I'd have a little more trouble with hard edges when I get to the darks. Sometimes if everything's working right, but I feel like some edges are too hard, I might just go over it with water to soften it, if that makes sense. So notice the difference from the left to the right side of his face, and what a difference that nice warm yellow is making. I clipped the section where I mixed this warm color, and unfortunately I'm not aware while I'm recording this that the palette isn't showing, but my guess is I took Windsor Yellow Deep and added just a touch of Quin Coral to make this nice warm color. And there you see where we are at this point. We're very close. Looks like I still need to darken some areas, but the face is really reading. The warmth really corrected the purple. Okay, we're getting close here. So basically, when I take a break, I assess the values and just get back to it. decided I needed to add some more tone to the teeth. They're still too white, so just do a little bit of peacock blue with a little bit of Scarlet Lake. It makes a real pretty purpley gray, and I'm going ahead and using that on the eyes as well. That's my damp brush, keeping the white areas white where I accidentally went over it. Mineral violet, getting some of that dark rim around the eyes and in the shadow areas of the iris. The purple not only darkens the brown eyes, but it just adds interest. I could also do ultramarine blue or green, which I often do with the brown eyes. And I grabbed a little Quinburnt orange, continuing to play around with those eyes. I want them perfectly imperfect. Need a little more dark, so popping that in to the pupil, into the darkest dark areas in the hat, just here and there. Colors dry so much lighter that we're constantly reinforcing these darks. This is my Rosemary Eradicator brush. The medium is my favorite. I do have small and large as well, but the medium is the way I like it. So you can lift little tiny circles, you can lift fine lines. Just kind of tickling, getting edges in important areas perfect. We don't want everything perfect, but so we're getting really close. And you can see I haven't gone nearly as dark as the reference photo. And sometimes I think I'm finished, I sign my painting, and then I decide I need the colors to be more vibrant, and I'll do another layer. But if I kind of have the sense that I'm getting close to being done, it's safer to stop and rather than go too far. So I hope you've enjoyed this little paint along with me. If you don't have an eradicator brush, you can use a stiff, small, flat brush. Kind of works the same way. That's what I used before I got my rosemary. You can even take a Klinsky sable and, although I don't think I would use a new one, but maybe an older one that's lost its point, you can manipulate those to lift little shapes as well. I just don't recommend scrubber brushes. I think they're too harsh, at least for this. And then the highlights, I don't want those to be too perfect either, so I might soften an edge so it's got like partial hard edges and a little bit of softness. Just really observing the photograph as well as seeing what the painting needs. And I'm grabbing my black mixture. This is phthalo blue, red no, I think it's Phthalo Blue green shade with Perylene Maroon. And I've got my tiny, tiny #2 synthetic brush, and I'm signing my painting. And I can never just sign my painting without adding a little more black to the pupils or to an eyelash, and then I'm calling it done. Okay, maybe a few more eyelashes. Okay, you can assess the final colors with the final painting here, and I hope you had fun. Thanks again.
Thank you for spending time with me today. I hope that you found a lot of benefit from this tutorial, maybe some insight into how I think, maybe more so than step-by-step details. You can play this video again using your own reference photo and just kind of following the steps that way. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, be sure to sign up for my newsletter. I constantly sharing tips and techniques and upcoming events and things like that. So if you're interested, I'd love for you to follow me there. I always encourage questions and comments. I love to know what you're thinking and what you'd like to learn. So don't hesitate to contact me. My website is www.janheltonartworks.com, and you can email me at janine@janheltonartworks.com. Have a great day.